Broadcasting live from the Subaru of Gwinnett studio inside the Sonesta Gwinnett Place Atlanta Hotel. It's time for Travel Safely with Bryan Mulligan. Travel Safely is presented by Applied Information, creator of the Travel Safely smartphone app.
This special edition of Travel Safely with Bryan Mulligan features an installment from a limited series called Coping with COVID. Hosted by Bryan Mulligan, the president of Applied Information, Coping with COVID shares the stories and successes of people and organizations during these unprecedented times of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hello and welcome to Coping with COVID. I'm your host, Bryan Mulligan. On this program, we'll help tell the stories and share the successes of people and organizations as we all deal with this COVID-19 pandemic. Our focus is on keeping people safe and at the same time re-energizing the economy. Our guest today is Michael Sullivan, President and CEO of the American Council of Engineering Companies, Georgia, of which Applied Information is a proud member. Sully, welcome to Coping with COVID.
Thank you for having me.
What we're going to talk about is two things. One is how your organization has dealt with it, and one is how your members are dealing with it. We're all figuring out that this COVID thing's going to be with us for a while. How's your organization dealing with it? Are you still working from home? What are you doing?
We started working from home on March 13th. Fortunately, we had all the tools and technologies in place to do that. Server in the cloud, Microsoft 360, right? It's not Office 365 anymore. So we had all those tools in place. Everyone had a laptop. For several weeks before, we had been telling everybody to take their laptop home with them every night just in case something happened. And so we were in a position to start working remotely immediately on March 13th. The transition was good. We learned a little bit about different meeting platforms and which ones we liked best, Teams and GoToMeeting, and ultimately we settled on Zoom for our external communications, where we're meeting with our members, and Zoom for our internal communications, our Teams for our internal communications. So it was a pretty easy transition for us, and we just transitioned back to the office for a limited work week on Monday. So our schedule will be Mondays through Wednesdays in the office, Thursdays and Fridays working remotely at home.
Okay, what was your sense about productivity and remote working? Is this a one and done kind of thing, or are you thinking about extending this to part of your structure going forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think, at the end of the day, the more interesting question is, what are we doing for our members and what have our members been doing? But I have spent a lot of time thinking about how what we've learned from COVID-19, which those lessons we did not choose to learn, but we are learning them nonetheless, how that's going to impact our members going forward. And I often have to remind myself, well, I need to learn those lessons too. I have an office that I'm running. I don't need to just think about it in the terms of our members. So we've had a lot of discussions as a staff, and I think one thing that we've all acknowledged is the idea of an everyday, 5 days a week, 10 hours a day in the office all the time work world is probably not going to return, even if we could snap our fingers and make COVID-19 go away.
Because that's quite interesting from the traffic and transportation side, is there's obviously going to be a big change in demand for traffic and transportation services if people work from home, and air quality and all kinds of things. So it's just interesting, not only from your internal staff, but from your members. What are you hearing from them?
One of the first things we started doing for our members was calling our members and talking to them and asking, how you doing? What can we be working on for you? The answer that we got was most of them were as busy as they had ever been. So to the question of productivity, I think the general consensus, my consensus with my staff, as well as the member firm leaders that I've talked to, feel like productivity was high. In some instances, higher than it had been before. Several of our folks reported that they felt like their teams were collaborating at a higher level, working remotely than they had been when they were working in the office. So I think the collaboration has been good. I think the productivity has been good. And I think for the most part, our members have, again, been as busy or maybe busier than they've ever been. Obviously, there are concerns about what Q3 and Q4 look like as public sector revenues decline.
That's a big concern.
Although the good news is that, at least in the transportation context, the revenue news hasn't been quite as dire as we thought it would be. March ended up being extremely strong. April was down, but stronger than we thought it would be, because obviously freight's still moving and things like that. I think there's also, so many of the programs like SPLOST and TIA, Transportation Investment Act, they're sales tax funded. They were so far ahead of budget because revenues were so much higher than had initially projected, that if this downturn in our economy, and in particular sales tax revenue and excise fuel tax revenue, if those are relatively short-lived, while we certainly will experience a decrease in revenue, we'll still be ahead of budget, or at least around the budget level, because revenues were so high before. Okay, so then if whatever might give us that cushion we need to see what happens through the end of the year, and then what happens next year is sort of a little bit of an open question. Mm-hmm. I think that's actually great news as far as re-energizing the economy, and gives the folks like us, business leaders, the confidence to make investments, especially on the technology side. We continually being pulled to invest, and that's on the basis that there's going to be future revenues. So the outlook from you guys is that things are interesting and uncertain, but not imminent catastrophe. I think not as dire as we would have thought in, say, the middle or end of March, where it seemed like the world had stopped and it was easy to sort of extrapolate that forward and see some really dire conclusions. Again, the revenues were so high and they haven't dropped as far as we thought. Even state revenues, overall state revenues, Governor Kemp initially had said he was asking state departments to make a 14% budget cut, but as he got new revenue data that was better, that went from 14 to 11, and I think those trends hopefully will continue as the economy starts to rebound. So that, in the context of re-energizing the economy, that's all good news. What about the keeping people safe? What's your sense out of your members? Is this a concern? Would you think that folks are generally being supportive of some of the public health guidelines? What's your sense about everybody staying safe through all of this? Yeah, I think so. I think certainly the response, I said we'd been working remotely since March 13th. That was, kind of that period of time where everything kind of turned pear-shaped very quickly. I'm not aware of any members that didn't do the same thing. Even firms that weren't fortunate enough to have the technologies and the infrastructure in place to do that. I mean, we had firms where they were sending folks down home with their desktop tower and their monitors off their desk, like just take them home and work from home. They weren't in a position to do it, but they did it because it was the right thing to do. I think engineers, of course, the basis of the engineer's charge is the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. And I think people take that seriously. And I think as you've seen the conversation around transitioning back to working in the office, most of our firms have taken a slow, deliberate, careful approach to make sure that they can provide a safe working environment for their folks when they do return back to the office. So I'm only aware of one firm that's gone back to 100% back in the office. Most firms are taking sort of a phased approach or a shift approach. They're really taking social distancing seriously, and they're putting protocols in place to effectuate that, which is a real challenge for some of our firms because, as you probably know, a lot of engineering firms embraced the open concept floor plan a few years ago, and that's a difficult thing to social distance within. I was in a furniture store the other day picking up a lateral file cabinet for my home office, and in the showroom, all of the desks had these mounted plexiglass panels on the fronts of the desks to social distance. And I asked the guy, I said, "Hey, are those selling?" He says, "Well, they're selling like hotcakes, and there's apparently a nationwide shortage on plexiglass." Wow. Because so many companies are buying plexiglass panels and things like that. Well, that's actually a great sort of juxtaposition. We did have a shortage of toilet paper, and now we've got a shortage of plexiglass. I'll choose the plexiglass things. The trick is if we can figure out which companies to invest in for the next thing that'll be in high demand. Yeah, I guess the thing to be careful of is airplanes probably not going to come back
very quickly, people cutting back travel, things like that?
Yeah, so I think from our member standpoint, we have seen no cuts really in staffing.
Yeah.
Because again, they're busier than they ever have been. So that has remained strong, and actually folks are still hiring. Those cuts have been in things like non-essential travel, conferences, anything that's outside of the office. Certainly anything requires a flight is treated differently than something you can drive to, for sure, by our member firms. Those are pretty much company-wide policies that have been put in place across the board.
So I think that's, potentially there are going to be aspects of the economy that take longer, or possibly there'll be a change that people will just fly less in perpetuity because they've got used to the idea of remote conferencing. We certainly found that customers are used to seeing you now over Zoom as instead of in person.
Well, I think that's one of the things, again, I think it's important for us as the Trade Association for the Engineering Industry to sort of keep our finger on the pulse of these changes and also kind of present our members with some business-centered learning from this. And I think one of the things we've got to realize is this remote meeting, remote working genie is not going back in the bottle. Your employees have experienced it, so you're not going to be able to tell them, no, remote working is not possible. You couldn't possibly work from home because you've got a doctor's appointment today. You've experienced it. Our firm leaders have seen the productivity increases. They've seen that it is possible to work remotely and be productive and be efficient. But more importantly, to your point, our clients have experienced it. So some of that travel, maybe the resistance is COVID-19 related. Maybe the resistance is that in the new normal, the next normal, clients aren't going to be as willing to pay for you to hop on a plane and come visit for a 1-hour meeting that they could just as easily accomplish on a Zoom.
That's actually a great point, that the clients are experiencing a saving as well, and that's a great driver of behavior.
Yes.
One of the things we touched on earlier when I spoke about in the last show was the science of mask wearing. Mm-hmm. What's your sense about all of that and the politics around mask wearing, or absence of politics, or what should we do?
I'm a political person by nature. I'm a lobbyist and a government affairs professional. And I cannot wrap my mind around how the wearing of a mask is somehow political. It is mystifying to me. It seems pretty clear that that's one of the most effective ways, if we're trying to reopen the economy, if we're trying to get people back in the places that they want to go, either for pleasure or for business, to reopen our economy. A mask is one of the most effective tools we collectively can adopt to make that happen. Wash your hands, wear a mask, socially distance. If we're willing to do those things, then we can reopen the economy much more quickly than if we view it as some sort of a political statement or some sort of I'm a tough guy because I'm not wearing a mask.
False bravado, essentially. Let's just do it, get a move on, get the economy humming, then we all benefit. Everybody's ahead of the game if the economy's flying.
Yeah, and it's I don't know if you've seen it. There's a picture that was circulating. I think it was published in the Atlanta Journal, at least on their website. It was a Georgia Tech football game from 1919.
I did see that.
And first of all, the stands are entirely men, and every single person in the stands is wearing a mask.
Yeah.
Seems like we would have learned a lesson that they learned apparently 100 years ago.
One of the things we do at Applied Information is we turn data into information. So obviously there's a great deal of data underneath this COVID-19 pandemic, and as the time goes by, we are able to see some interesting analysis. So what we've got here is an interesting chart that caught my mind, originally dated down by the Financial Times. But what it does is it analyzes what they call clusters. Now, the interesting thing about clusters is that the spread of COVID is what they call asymmetrical. And what that means is that 80% of the spread is carried out by 10% of the people. There are these large outbreaks, and that's really affected the overall numbers. And as business leaders and others are navigating our way, what is dangerous, what is not dangerous, I thought that this was quite interesting, especially against the context of, in Georgia here, roughly 50% of the COVID deaths have occurred in care homes, long-term care facilities. So they're just particularly vulnerable. And you can see that, that nationally, this is now 61% occur in care homes. A further 19% are in detention centers. The prisons are badly affected. For whatever reason, the next in line is the meatpacking plants and the food processing centers. Then rehabilitation centers, those are also health facilities. And what is really interesting, that there's only 5% of these super spreading events that occur in other activities. And just interesting for me is the next level of detail we need to drill down. In other words, are open plan offices more dangerous than closed offices? And are, what is the implications of bars and restaurants or choirs versus non-singing churches? And it seems like there's going to need to be a lot of work on the granularity of how most of our live our lives. Because just looking at the broad statistics shows that most of the outbreaks occur in things that I'm not doing on a day-to-day basis.
For sure.
So we look forward to that data emerging and that granularity so that we can further guide. We're all engineers and we're all focused on keeping our people safe, most importantly, and at the same time revitalizing the economy.
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind, though, particularly when we're talking about data around a pathogen that didn't exist 8 months ago, right?
Yeah.
So some of that's going to change. Perception is just as real as reality when we're talking about reopening the economy. So whether it's trying to give your employees some comfort in how they can come back in the office and feel safe, even if statistically, mathematically speaking, they're very safe. Some of this is just sort of what we need to do to give folks comfort to either come back into the workplace or to go into a restaurant or go into a place of business in order to get the economy moving, even if it may be not mathematically speaking or statistically speaking required to keep them safe.
Yeah, because actually I think that's something that we all know is the great American economy is based on confidence.
Right.
And that's what we've got to do, is figure out, give folks the confidence to go into your place of work and go and buy your new car and things like this.
Yeah, not to denigrate what we did after 9/11 with the Department of Homeland Security and the FAA, but a lot of what we do in airports is at least as much about providing people confidence about getting on that airplane as it is about actually stopping threats to people.
Correct. Thank you, Sully, for being our guest today.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. Very helpful and informative. Thanks so much for joining us today. As I say, I'm Bryan Mulligan, and until next time, be safe and stay healthy.